Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. Would ask those here in-house to make sure cell phones have been turned off as a courtesy to our speakers as we prepare to begin. And, of course, we will post the program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference following today's presentation. Hosting our discussion is Brian Riley. Mr. Riley is our J. Van Andel Senior Policy Analyst in Trade Policy in the Center for Trade and Economics. He is a contributor to Heritage's annual Index of Economic Freedom, which measures and compares countries around the world on 10 specific factors of economic freedom. His free trade research focuses on countering inaccurate and misleading misinformation that undermines the economic and development benefits of free trade. Prior to his work here at Heritage, he also managed grassroots campaigns in support of the North American Free Trade Agreement. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Kansas State University and a master's degree in economics from the University of Southern California. Please join me in welcoming Brian Riley. Brian?
Thank you. Thank you all, and welcome to the Heritage Foundation on behalf of myself and my colleague Darren Baxt, who is our research fellow in agricultural policy. And for those of you who don't know Darren, he is right over here. As John mentioned, my background is in economics, and any of you who have studied economics are probably familiar with something called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Those of you who haven't studied economics but have watched a movie called Ferris Bueller's Day Off may also be familiar with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. It was a policy that is widely agreed to have contributed to the Great Depression and to contribute to global nationalism and to political tensions. The following quote is from a website, ushistory.org. And ushistory.org had this to say: aspects of the disastrous Hawley-Smoot tariff still live on. Section 304 requires country of origin labeling on all carcasses and retail products. You'd better check your carcasses and products to see whether or not they comply. Well, it turns out this isn't necessarily as easy as it sounds. If any of you have been shopping for a new car recently and looked at the label on the window sticker that has where the car originates, there's no differentiation between U.S. and Canadian parts. U.S. and Canadian parts, they're all counted the same when it comes to cars. If you have an iPhone like this one, on the back it says assembled in China, even though most of the parts are from Germany or Japan, and most of the value in this iPhone is not from China, but it's from the United States. So labeling is a lot trickier than it probably sounded in 1930 when the Smoot-Hawley tariff passed. Today's panel is going to discuss a topic that is both timely and controversial, and that is country of origin labeling with respect to agricultural products, in particular beef and pork. And we have a great panel of experts. What I'm going to do is briefly introduce them and give them each a few minutes to talk about their particular area of expertise and interest, and then we'll open it up to some questions. Our first speaker to my left is Mark Dopp. Mark is General Counsel and Senior Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for the American Meat Institute, and Mark will give us some background information, some history. He mentioned to me he's been working on this for probably more years than I realized the issue has been around. And then we'll hear from Edward Farrell, who's counsel for the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. He's also principal at OFW Law, and he'll provide a perspective from our country's largest trading partner. And then finally, one of the district's most important trade policy experts, John Murphy, will comment on the trade aspects of this and the WTO ruling and potential for retaliation and what that can mean for the U.S. economy. So with that, Mark, I'll turn it over to you to lead things off.
Thank you, Brian. Good afternoon, everyone. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. Appreciate the opportunity to share some of the insights and thoughts of the meat industry, the American Meat Institute. Brian's right. I mentioned we were staying out in the hall. I was working, my first recollection of working on the issue of mandatory cool, because origin labeling has been around for a lot longer than that, but my first recollection of dealing with mandatory cool, I was still at Hogan and Hartson at the time, and I've been at AMI for 15 years, so this probably at least dates back to 97 or 98. Ed, you may even remember it before then, but by way of background, I'll give you a little background, a little primer, if you will, and then share some thoughts of AMI and the meat industry. Let me say first that the idea of country of origin labeling is not new, and it's not new with respect to meat products. A lot of people don't know that before the mandatory cool program, the statute came about in 2002, the Agricultural Marketing Service for years had a country of origin labeling program. And they stopped doing it. And they stopped doing it. Why? Because nobody used it. And why? Because nobody cared. So the genesis of origin labeling from a voluntary standpoint is not new. Now, a little background on the statute. Everybody knows this particular mandatory law came about in the 2002 Farm Bill. It had been debated several times before, earlier years, sometimes in appropriations, this and that. As a practical matter, we have this law because it was a political trade-off. There were other issues that the meat industry thought were more important to not be included in the 2002 Farm Bill, so we swallowed hard and accepted this. The rule that is, and I'll talk about the current rule in a little bit, but the rule that's currently before us that we're fighting about right now, it's not the first iteration of this rule. This production step labeling rule was first proposed in 2003. And let me tell you, it was incredibly difficult. The issue of production step labeling, it's not doable, which is, again, why we are fighting about this on a couple different fronts. You may remember back in that 2003 proposal, the agency also came up with the idea of requiring that all ground beef products, for example, list in order of predominance by weight, where the countries. So if most of the product, if in your 1 pound package of ground beef, it might have product that originated in the United States, New Zealand, and Australia. Well, you had to, the retailer was being told, you've got to parse out if half of it was U.S. and a third and a quarter is Australian and a quarter is New Zealand. You know, you're back to listing it U.S., New Zealand, and Australia. Conversely, if most of it came from Australia, you had to have Australia, U.S. It was unworkable. The complexities of that rule resulted in a number of delays, both through appropriations and other vehicles, and ultimately got us to the 2008 Farm Bill. So the 2008 Farm Bill fixes the ground beef problem. It is silent largely for purposes of dealing with muscle cuts, and that's what we're, again, arguing about now. But the agency, to its credit, AMS to its credit, decided that we're not going to make this as complicated as they originally had proposed. So AMS proposed something that, frankly, from a meat industry standpoint, although not preferable, because again we are opposed to mandatory cool, it was at least manageable. And what it did, that 2009 final rule, allowed the industry to what we call commingle. In other words, if I'm bringing in cattle that are of Mexican origin or Canadian origin and mixing them, and I'm processing them in my facility in Washington State or Oklahoma or Nebraska, wherever it might be, if I wanted to utilize livestock from more than one country, whose origins are more than one country, I could simply say product to U.S., comma Canada, comma Mexico if I'm using all three, or the more likely scenario was we had facilities that were using either Canadian cattle, Canadian origin cattle, or Mexican origin cattle, and it said product of U.S., comma Canada, or product to U.S., comma Mexico. Again, not preferable, and frankly, many plants just decided we're not going to deal with this. We are going to source all of our livestock from U.S.-born cattle or U.S.-born hogs. I can tell you that kind of decision-making is a function of the costs associated with segregation, not only of the livestock in the pens, but at the feedlot, and then all of the product that flows through the distribution chain all the way to retail. So, again, a manageable solution for the industry, not a manageable solution for the Canadians and the Mexicans that Ed will talk about here in a few minutes. That 2009 rule prompted the Canadians and the Mexicans to bring their first WTO case. The panel came back in favor of the Canadian and Mexican governments. The U.S. appealed, the appellate body upheld the Canadian-Mexican position. That led us, and that was in 2012, that led us to USDA AMS publishing the 2013 rule, and that's where we are today. Again, we are focused solely on muscle cuts, and we are back 10 years later, or at that time 10 years later, back to the original 2003 proposal where we're back to production step labeling. And the agency very specifically said, this effectively eliminates commingling. So this rule that AMS published in 2013 didn't make things better. The agency, I guess, thought by providing more information, they were accommodating the needs or the requests of the WTO. It made things worse. And I don't know, Ed, you're probably going to talk about how the costs attendant to this for the Canadian and Mexican producers went up, and I think they went up fairly markedly. I might also add that the production step labeling not only was more complicated for the producers, the feedlots, it made things incredibly more, significantly more complicated for the packers. Imagine, if you will, a circumstance in which you have livestock that are all Americans, and there are some plants, frankly, that have to source cattle that were either born in Mexico or Canada. They have to. There simply are not enough cattle in certain parts of the country to be able to run your plant at an efficient level, make the numbers work, because in our industry it is largely about volume. They simply have to source those. So imagine the complexities involved with dealing with segregating the cattle that are born in Mexico and then raised in the U.S. and slaughtered in the U.S. That's one category. Born in Canada, raised in the U.S. and slaughtered in the U.S. That's another category. We also have direct for slaughter cattle that come in from Canada. That's another category. And then we have animals that obviously are born and raised in the U.S. and then slaughtered at the same facility. So you got at least four different categories. That means four different lines, or not four different lines, but four different areas in the coolers that have to be, where the animals, the carcasses have to be segregated. The box product has to be segregated all the way through the distribution chain, and the complexities extend all the way through the retail store, because the retailer is going to have to make those changes as well. What happens? Some of the retailers said, we're not going to buy those products. I want one. I want something that says product of the U.S. or born, raised, and slaughtered in the U.S. in this case. So we had retailers making those decisions. We've had the packers making those decisions. That led to the Canadians and Mexicans taking the action that they did. I can tell you with some degree of certainty that while cool has not in and of itself resulted in certain plants or feedlots going out of business, it has been a contributing factor. So again, I'll sum up here in the next minute or so. We have the WTO case. The current WTO case, the panel report came out. Not only did the U.S. lose in the TBT, I'm going to defer to Ed on a lot of the WTO stuff because he's probably forgotten more international trade law than I'll ever know, but the panel ruled against the U.S. in the TBT 2.1 and GATT Article 3, Section 4. What the U.S. will do, I don't know. Let me sum up by saying this, adding this to the conversation. We believe we have long been opposed to mandatory cool. And the origins of this law, everybody should know. It's not about the consumer's right to know. I believe the consumer has the right to ask, but we have litigation ongoing about the First Amendment issues attendant to this. But this is all about keeping Canadian and Mexican cattle out of this country. And the reason I say that is if anybody thinks it's about the consumer right to know, then they've got to think seriously about the food service and the processed products exemption. Because if you have the right to know where your beef or your pork comes from when you buy it at the grocery store, then why don't you have the right to know when you buy that, when you have a hamburger at McDonald's or bacon at Giant? So I'll stop there, turn it over to Ed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, thanks. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here, and I thank you for the opportunity to talk to this group. This does go back a long ways, and as Mark said, I think we first started to hear about it in 1998. The statute was 2002, and I think it's worth just briefly looking at the context in the market that this measure was inserted into. Under NAFTA, the North American livestock complex became increasingly integrated and increasingly efficient. It is, in fact, a testament to NAFTA at how well it worked in integrating the markets. And if you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense. If you look at the cattle industry, for example, in Canada, most of the cattle are out in the West, a lot in Alberta. That's not particularly near the meat markets in the population centers in the east of Canada. So it makes an awful lot of sense for cattle to be slaughtered in the West, either in Canada or the U.S., crossing that border freely, for the meat then to move to the east. So you have natural flows that are dictated just by pure economics. Likewise, it's a very efficient system to compensate for seasonal events, such as drought in the U.S. If you have drought in the U.S., you can fill the supply need if Canada's having a good season, and vice versa. So it's increasing flexibility to source your cattle and supply your meat throughout North America, and also create a competitive advantage. And I think this is hugely important, a competitive advantage for export markets. The U.S., Canada, and Mexico are not the only countries that are exporting beef. And the integration of the industries in North America has made them far more competitive in markets like, for example, Japan, where they compete head-on with Australia, and other markets where Brazil and Argentina are becoming, and Uruguay, increasingly active competitors. So NAFTA worked. If you look at the trade flows, I just looked at some numbers for 2013. Just looking at beef alone, and this is replicated in pork as well, the U.S. exported 403 million pounds to Mexico and 468 million pounds to Canada, making those two countries the second and third largest export markets for beef. At the same time, the U.S. imported about 1 million head of cattle each from Mexico and Canada. Now, that's only about 3% of cattle slaughter in the U.S., somewhere between 3 and 5%. So it wouldn't seem to be a huge number, but as Mark pointed out, it's really important regionally. There are plants, particularly in the Pacific Northwest with respect to Canada, that are really dependent on Canadian cattle to have sufficient throughput to keep those plants competitive. So it's regionally extremely important. So on this kind of nicely integrated market, we have the enactment of COOL. And so, what did that do, and, why is Canada so exercised about it? Well, again, as Mark pointed out, it forces segregation. In order to label accurately, you have to segregate both the livestock, and you have to segregate the meat produced from them in order to accurately label the product. And the easiest way to avoid the costs associated with segregation is simply not to buy Canadian or Mexican cattle. So to the extent that you can source cattle sufficient for your operation in the U.S., you incur no segregation costs. And that sets the price in the market. So a slaughterhouse producing born, raised, and slaughtered in the U.S. has no segregation costs and can price into retail accordingly. You take that plant in the Pacific Northwest that needs the Canadian cattle, they have no choice but to take them, but then they have to meet the price of the slaughter facility that has no segregation costs. So what happens? How do you do that? Well, you can't increase the price to retail because you've got that benchmark you've got to hit. So those costs get passed back to the producers in Canada and Mexico. And that's just how the economics works. And it is because of this that Canada and Mexico bought the WTO case. The upshot, as Mark has said, is that Canada and Mexico prevailed in the original round on appeal, and now again in front of the compliance panel. The compliance panel dealing with the even more onerous regulation that was put in place last year. So what does Canada see as or I can't speak for Canada, but I can speak for my client, the CCA. What do they see as the way out of this? What's the fix? And basically the fix is to eliminate segregation. You just have to get that cost out of the stream. And until you do that, you are going to continue to discriminate against imported livestock just based on the economic logic that I just set out. So our bottom line is that for the U.S. to come into compliance, it has to make a legislative change, and the legislative change has to be sufficient to eliminate the need to segregate. I should also point out that my client is not anti-country of origin labeling. We've got no problem labeling Canadian beef that comes in from Canada to the U.S. as product of Canada. In fact, my guys are very proud of it. There's absolutely no fundamental issue with the notion of country of origin labeling. The fundamental issue is with how this particular statutory regulatory scheme operates in the market to force costs back up the chain to Canadian producers. So at that point, I'll stop and pass it to John.
Great. Well, thank you, Brian. I really appreciate the invitation, and Darren. It's great that Heritage puts together these sessions. This is actually quite timely, I think. I'm going to try to answer 3 additional questions about why COOL is bad policy, what are the implications of the possible retaliation, and what should the United States do about it. You've heard good perspectives here from the perspective of the sector directly targeted by the COOL rule for muscle cuts of meat from both the U.S. and from Canada. In adding to their views, I'd like to speak from the perspective of the broad new COOL Reform Coalition, which is now co-chaired by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers. This coalition is working to build on the many years of work of others, from groups such as AMI, the cattlemen, and others. But in this new phase, broad industry groups like the Chamber have joined in to signal our concern about the broader impacts on many sectors of agriculture and industry and manufacturing that could possibly suffer harm in this case as well, not just because of the direct costs you've heard about, but because of the possible retaliation. So this dispute is also about whether the United States will meet the obligations it's undertaken as a member of the World Trade Organization. From our perspective, as a rule, we flaunt these obligations at our peril and at our cost. Since the WTO was created in 1995, other countries have brought a number of disputes against the United States, and the United States has lost a number of these. But the United States has almost always amended its laws or changed its practices to conform with these adverse rulings. It hasn't always been quick, and it hasn't always been pretty, but we have. And we've done so as a nation because it is in the long-term economic interests of the United States to live by the rules of the international trading system. After all, our country did more than any other to write these rules, from the GATT in 1947 to the WTO in 1995. And many studies show the broad benefits the United States derives from this open, rules-based trading system. One widely cited study shows that trade liberalization under these rules has boosted the income of the average American household by about $10,000 annually. But in addition to that, American workers and farmers and companies rely on these rules to secure access to overseas markets. Just last month, a WTO panel ruled against India in a dispute brought by the United States relating to Indian restrictions on the importation of U.S. agricultural products. As Ambassador Froman said at the time, this victory affirms the administration's commitment to ensuring WTO members play by the rules and that America's farmers, workers, and businesses get the fair shot they deserve to sell made-in-America goods under WTO rules. So today, the shoe's on the other foot. We recognize that 95% of the world's consumers live outside our markets, but American farmers and ranchers and workers and companies won't be able to sell to them if we don't live by those rules ourselves. So those are the principles. If these principled arguments are insufficient, the threat of WTO-authorized retaliation by Canada and Mexico should concentrate minds. Now, these two countries are by far America's largest export markets. Trade with Canada and Mexico supports nearly 14 million American jobs. WTO-authorized retaliation by two of the largest U.S. export partners, trading partners, could result in losses in the billions of dollars across multiple sectors, including food production, agriculture, and many manufacturing sectors. This isn't just speculation either. After a dispute settlement panel ruled in Mexico's favor in the cross-border trucking dispute, Mexico levied steep retaliatory duties on $2.4 billion worth of U.S. goods just a few years ago. The memory of this is very present in the U.S. business community today. The impact was devastating on a number of sectors. If you'd like a preview of what this could look like, I invite you to visit the Coalition's website, which is www.coolreform.com. We have a map that shows the products likely to face retaliation and where they are made by state. In our view, it would be intolerable to sit back and watch this movie again. Most recently, supporters of COOL have said the United States must appeal the ruling. One prominent COOL supporter told a press conference recently that undoubtedly the result of an appeal is going to be somewhat different from the October ruling. He further said there is a strong legal standing to resolve the dispute and said the United States may win on appeal. This is highly unlikely. The most recent WTO panel finds the United States has violated not just one but two agreements, as was mentioned, the bedrock GATT 1994 agreement, which is the cornerstone of the WTO, as well as the technical barriers to trade agreement. And the latest report, as Mark mentioned, finds that the latest revised version of the COOL rule made it even more discriminatory. So supporters of COOL are saying that there's no rush, but they're wrong. There's little time to avoid retaliation. A final adjudication by the WTO of U.S. noncompliance with its international trade obligations could come as early as next spring. Upon this final adjudication, retaliation by Canada and Mexico that would cost the United States billions of dollars in annual exports could be authorized as soon as 60 days thereafter. The American legislative process sometimes moves slowly. He deadpanned. Congressional action within 60 days of a final adjudication by the WTO is highly unlikely. If Congress waits for this to happen before acting, significant economic harm is almost assured. Moreover, as we learned in the cross-border trucking dispute, export sales of products targeted for retaliation can be lost even before that retaliation takes place. And once those export sales relationships are lost, it often takes years to recover market share. So we believe that Congress can and must act now to approve legislation that will allow immediate action to comply with a final adjudication in this dispute. We're not prejudging a possible appeal. In the unlikely event of an appeal overturning the WTO's multiple rulings against the COOL rule that we've already seen, this proposal could be framed in a way that it would have no effect. But American workers and farmers will pay a high price if we allow even a brief period of noncompliance after the final adjudication. We must comply with our trade obligations, and the time to act is now. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I open up to questions, I had one general question, mainly for you, Mark, but anybody who would want to comment. If I understand you correctly, you're totally fine with the idea if I, as a consumer, want to buy a product, mainly, let's say I want locally raised Maryland beef, or Kansas beef, or Texas, or U.S. beef. You're fine with me requesting that. It's the mandatory aspect that is the concern. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, the Agricultural Marketing Service, for example, has dozens of programs. Natural, organic. Well, the organic is a statutory provision with a set of regulations, but nobody's required to declare something to be organic or not. I mean, the products aren't. You don't see something else that says non-organic if it doesn't meet the statutory requirement. If somebody wants to produce something that is organic, they have to meet the set of rules. That's fine. AMS, like I said, has programs about natural, humanely raised. The list goes on and on and on for companies that believe they can make more money by delivering those types of products. In this case, if the proof is in the pudding. AMS had a program that permitted people to declare the origin of the products. And they had that program for years and years and years. And it doesn't exist because nobody used it. And nobody used it because consumers did not ask for that or demand that information. Like I said, it's the mandatory part. Consumers have the right to ask. And if enough consumers ask and there is margin to be made, I can guarantee you the meat industry is looking to improve its margins wherever it can. We'll be happy to provide the information if there's a dollar to be made. It's that simple.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, in promulgating these rules, AMS acknowledged that there was absolutely no market failure here. It was not addressing a perceived need that was not being met by the market. So, absolutely, branded programs exist. Any number of designations, Rancher Select. I mean, there are just literally hundreds of brands out there that could incorporate, origin labeling, as they saw fit.
To Ed's point, I don't want to drag this on, but to Ed's point, if you go back and look at the 2009 rule, AMS, I had the quote and I didn't bring it with me. AMS said that the benefits are basically not quantifiable and they will be minimal, right? And then in the 2013 rule, they said, well, the benefits for the 2013 rule are going to be small compared to the benefits from the earlier rule. Well, if the other ones were small, then these are really small. In fact, they couldn't quantify those either. So just go back and read the preamble to the two final rules. It's amazing.
Well, thank you. We have a couple of microphones. If you have questions, please raise your hand. And we have a question up front. I'd ask you to wait for the microphone, not just for the people in the audience, but for the benefit of people who might be watching online. And also to please identify yourself before you ask your question. You have a question here. We need a microphone down here, please.
Brian Dabbs with International Trade Today. Thanks very much for speaking. Okay, so my question is, there's a few references to legislation that might remedy this in order to bring the regulations into compliance with global trade rules. The coalition has spoke on a number of occasions about legislatively providing USDA authority to rescind the portions of the regime that are determined uncompliant by the WTO. So now that observers have had an opportunity to pore over the report and the ruling in its entirety, what type of specific authority would you recommend is provided to USDA legislatively in order to, I think you said, immediate action? So in order to provide immediate action to USDA to bring the regime into compliance. And then my second question is, if I could just sneak another one in, please. Have there been any concrete evaluations on the competitive damage to the North American industry over the past, 5 years? And by that damage that I believe you referenced, Mr. Farrell, are you referring to damage to competitive competence, if you will, globally vis-a-vis other countries? Is that what you're referring to?
Well, if we take the second
Put it
question
first, yeah.
first, yeah. Actually, there was quite a bit of economic analysis which was done in conjunction with the WTO proceedings, which quantified the nature of the discrimination, the extent of the discrimination against the Canadian, livestock. There is, in addition to that, obviously, when you add cost to a system, no matter who bears that cost, you're going to become less competitive vis-a-vis your competitors that don't have those costs. So, clearly, if producers in Australia do not have the need to segregate their animals and you have to segregate them here, you are necessarily going to become less competitive vis-a-vis those exporters. Now, with respect to the retaliation amount, for example, in that Canada would be seeking to enforce with tariffs, well, that is based on the impact on the Canadian industry, as opposed to any sort of global loss of competitiveness.
I could add something to that. If you go back and look at the preamble to the 2009 rule, and this pretty much carries forward, the estimated cost to implement and administer this program globally in the United States was just shy of $4 billion to the affected industries. And that includes not only meat, but fruits and vegetables and nuts and everything else, right? Of that not quite $4 billion cost, $2.4 billion of that was specific to the meat industry. So that's a big number. Has anybody done an analysis since then? Not that I'm aware of, but like I said earlier, I can tell you, and it's a little difficult to parse this out, cool versus other things. The drought has had a tremendous impact on our industry and some other factors. But I can tell you that some of the plant closings that we have seen over the past few years, not directly attributable to cool, but the implementation having to comply with cool was a contributing factor to those facilities being shuttered. Again, not the only reason, because the drought's a big player here, but cool contributed to that. A plant in Texas, for example, went down a couple years ago. Most recently, one in Southern California. So, do I have a study? No. But are there real ramifications for this? Absolutely. To your first question, and I'll invite John and let me say this: the solution isn't via regulation. The statute has to be repealed. At least elements of the statute have to be repealed. Segregation is necessitated by the fact that a product may only be called a product of the U.S. if the animal was born, raised, and slaughtered in the U.S. And so long as we are bringing either Canadian or Mexican cattle or hogs into this country, the statute necessitates the segregation. There's no way around it. So there's not a regulatory, notwithstanding what other people say, there's not a regulatory solution here. It requires statutory repeal.
And I would just add, from the perspective of the broad coalition, there aren't a lot of legislative vehicles moving right now, but we're open-minded about where and how this can be done. And so in the weeks ahead, and failing that early in the next Congress, we are going to be looking for those opportunities to include some explicit language which will authorize and direct, as Mark says, to authorize and direct the Secretary of Agriculture to rescind those elements of cool which are deemed to be in violation of our WTO obligations in the event of a final adjudication against the United States. That phrase about "in the event of," what I'm responding to there is a charge from supporters of cool that our coalition is getting ahead of itself. Supporters of cool have said, "Oh, this is hasty. There's no need to rush. We're going to do an appeal." As I pointed out earlier, we cannot take that chance. But the way that we hope to frame this, that we suggest that it be framed, is that instruction, that authorization to the Secretary of Agriculture to rescind those elements of the rule that are in violation, that it be contingent on an adverse final adjudication. So in the incredibly unlikely event that the final adjudication does not go against the United States, the language would have no effect. So I want to be explicit about that because I don't want that argument of the supporters of COOL to be used against us.
Yeah, if I could just, add to that, with respect to the U.S. appealing, we of course would be very, very happy to see the U.S. not appeal and deal with the issue, right now, immediately, and correct it through the necessary amendments to the statute. Just to echo what John was saying, honestly, the U.S. It's very hard to see a path where the U.S. could prevail on appeal. One of the things that the panel did in this case that they did not do in the original case is actually make a finding under the GATT national treatment provision, Article 3.4. They did not make a finding in the initial proceedings for reasons of judicial economy, because it was then thought by the panel and, in fact, most WTO scholars that a finding under the technical barriers to trade national treatment provision was really analogous to a finding under the GATT national treatment provision. Subsequent interpretations by the appellate body have determined that that's not necessarily the case, that they are not exactly parallel. So the finding under GATT 3.4 is a separate finding which does not benefit from the exception language that has been created for 2.1. So I don't want to get any further into the weeds, but the likelihood of a path forward for the U.S. on appeal is remote, and I think it would behoove everybody to save the expense of sending people to Geneva and briefing this thing and just continuing the fight just to delay the inevitable outcome and just deal with the inevitable outcome now.
Up here, question up here. Here.
Thank you, Terry Miller from the Heritage Foundation. Protectionist regulations like this don't just pop up out of the ether. They happen because somebody lobbies for them, somebody benefits from them. Could one of you please just comment a little bit about who the advocates for this ridiculous regulation are and how they're benefiting and in what way they're benefiting from it? Thank you.
Well, yeah, of course you're going to look at me.
Well, no, I'm happy to have a shot too.
The short answer is the genesis of this is, you're right, it is a protectionist statute. That's what its intent was. That's how it came about. Without naming names, let's just say that there are cattle producers and cattle producing organizations along the northern tier that were looking for a way to blunt the competition coming in from Canada, Ed's clients. It's that simple. And it came about in the 2000 Farm Bill. There was a political trade-off. Industry was told, you'll either take this or you'll take that. The decision was politically to accept this in lieu of some other things that were deemed to be, that would be even more painful. It's that simple.
Yeah, and if I could put a bit of a point on that, this unnamed organization was actually founded in the late 1990s with the sole purpose of bringing a trade case against live cattle from Canada. That case, both a countervail and dumping case, were bought, were prosecuted, and the Canadians prevailed. Having lost that case, this organization then turned to country of origin labeling as an alternative protectionist measure to try to move forward. I think the irony here is that they may well have thought it would have helped them, but there's absolutely no evidence in the marketplace that it has. I mean, basically, all it has done is cost Canadian producers to no competitive real benefit to the U.S. producers. It just has embedded a cost that somebody else has to bear, but without giving the U.S. producer any additional profit.
Yeah, along those lines, in 2003, when AMS first published the first iteration of the rule, they went around the country, had about probably 15 or 16 events, and I went to most of them in various parts of Kearney, Nebraska. It's a beautiful place, love the people there, for what they call listening sessions. And I can tell you that the people who bought into this were being sold a bill of goods because they were being told that if you're able to sell your product and call it product of the U.S., you're going to get a 25-cent per pound premium. Now, Brian's got a couple degrees in economics. My degrees are in agricultural economics as well. I can tell you that when 90+% of the cattle in this country are American in origin, the economics don't dictate that 90% is going to generate a 25% per pound premium. It's just, I mean, even basic 101 economics tells you that. And that has not come to pass. What has come to pass is the penalties being imposed upon those who send Mexican or Canadian cattle to this country, and the same thing for hogs, and those who have to, the feedlots and the packers that buy them.
Question up here. I don't know if you can see me in the corner. There. Yeah.
Hi, my name's John Magnus. I have a question for the whole group, but it's prompted by something that was in Mark's comments about the signals that the retailers are sending backward through the value chain about how they don't want things to be any more complex than necessary. And it just sort of underscores that during this time period that all the regulated parties have been trying to adjust and deal with, in the near term with what the law is. My question is, has that process that has occurred of people adjusting to this regime made it harder now to solve the problem? And if you put back into place the opportunity to have something like a NAFTA label, would it even attract any traffic at this point? Or is it actually now an even more difficult problem because of what's happened during these last 5 years?
No, I think your point's well taken. Practices do get embedded in industries, which really underscores why a regulatory fix is simply not workable. Something that may have worked 6 years ago absolutely can't work now for the reasons you point out. It's just the trade has moved on, and in order to remedy the discrimination, you have to take it as you find it, and as you find it now is different than it was 6 years ago.
Yeah, I agree with Ed. It is certainly the case that a lot of the retailers, I mean, they absorbed the cost in 2009 of having to. One of the things they had to do through this whole exercise is go back of some of the Safeway stores, for example, and look at how they have to reconfigure or those little machines in the back where the butchers are, right? They have to be reprogrammed, and they had to be reprogrammed again for the 2013, and those are all sunk costs. There's no doubt about it. Having said that, I think if this went away, I think I would expect, I wouldn't be surprised if some companies decide that they're still going to ask and be able and provide that information because their customers, the consumers may very well want it at this point. But there are others, I'm quite confident, because I've talked to some of them, who will probably walk away from that, flip a switch and not have to print that little product. I mean, nobody likes to put slaughtered or harvested on their label as a starting point, okay? That's just not something that's very appetizing. So I think I think some companies would walk away from that.
Over here, and then gentleman to her right.
Krista Hughes from Reuters. A question for John, if I may. Just could you give us an example of the kinds of opportunities that you might be looking for legislatively over the next few weeks or early next year to get to attach that sort of language to that you mentioned? And would there be any advantage or disadvantage to getting this done in the current Congress as opposed to next year, say?
I think sooner is always better than later. So we are looking at what opportunities are here. You know, it's the day after the election, and how the government will continue to be funded after the CR expires in early December is not altogether clear. I understand that there may be some appropriations bills taken up in some form, or there may be a CR approach. It's just too early to say. But to the degree that we can figure out those opportunities in the week ahead, we want to take advantage of them. And we think that we've seen some progress on this in terms of the understanding in Congress. I'll just mention one member of Congress, Senator Grassley, who had traditionally been a supporter of coal when the latest ruling came out in October, issued a statement saying, you know, I've been a supporter of coal, but I also understand that we need to comply with our trade obligations. And so we do think that there's been some good there's growing awareness of the problem, and a sense that we need to act sooner rather than later to fix it.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll let them go back to work building our parking garage here. This gentleman in the back.
I want to follow William Bowles of the Bowles Company. Ms. Murphy, I just wanted to follow up on her question, sort of piggyback on that. Do you see the elections, the election results that occurred, especially in the Senate last night, as hindering your pursuit of legislation, or making it easier to get the necessary legislation that you seek?
Oh, I can't say that it's clear based on what we've seen just in the past 24 hours. But, you know, there is a good and growing base of support. I would have said, you know, there have been letters signed by, I think, more than 100 House members, for instance, a couple of months ago, supporting action to comply with U.S. trade obligations in this case. So we've got a good base to build on, and if we don't get it done here in the weeks ahead, then we'll be working to very early on in the new Congress to make that happen.
Do any of our panelists have a final point, comment you'd like to make? Yes.
Just one add-on to what John said earlier about the need for, from a policy perspective, for the U.S. to comply with WTO rulings. There have been a number of WTO rulings against the U.S., but there have been more WTO rulings for the U.S. The U.S. is a very active participant in bringing cases in the WTO, and has been very successful at it. So it is very much a two-way street, and we would, you know, like to see that compliance as quickly as possible.
And on that note, thank you all for coming, and will you join me in thanking our panelists this afternoon?